What if the flood wasn't punishment for sin at all, but something far more desperate? Enoch saw the real reason. He wrote it down. Then he stopped himself. What made him go silent? For thousands of years, people have been told the same simple story. God looked down at the earth, saw that men were wicked, and decided to wash it clean with water. Sunday school version. Neat and tidy. A God who gets angry, then fixes things with a flood, then moves on. But that story leaves out almost everything that actually happened in Genesis chapter 6, and it leaves out entirely what Enoch himself witnessed before the rain ever started falling. Genesis 6 opens with a sentence that most translations rush past. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Sons of God, not sons of Adam, not tribal leaders or powerful kings, as some modern commentaries try to soften it into. In the Hebrew scriptures, the phrase Bene Elohim is used elsewhere only for heavenly beings, members of the divine council, angelic figures who stood in the presence of God. Job uses the same term for angels, who shouted for joy at creation. So when Genesis says these beings came down and took human wives, it is not describing a political marriage. It is describing something that was never supposed to happen, a boundary between heaven and earth, crossed on purpose. Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, was the one man who saw behind the curtain of that sentence. The Book of Enoch does not summarize what happened in a single verse. It names names. 200 watchers, angelic guardians assigned to observe humanity, descended on Mount Hermon and bound themselves by oath to break their assigned purpose. Their leader, Semjaza, made the others swear together so that none could back out and leave the rest to bear the blame alone. Then they went down to the daughters of men, and what came from that union was not simply children, it was something the earth had never had to hold before. The offspring were called Nephilim, but Enoch gives a more disturbing detail that Genesis only hints at. These were not merely large men. Enoch describes beings that grew without limit, whose hunger could not be satisfied by ordinary food, who eventually turned on animals, then on each other, and finally on humanity itself. They devoured the labor of all the children of men, and men were unable to supply them. Whole villages could not produce enough to feed them. When the food ran out, according to Enoch, the giants began consuming human flesh and drinking blood. This is the detail most churches never mention, because it changes the entire moral weight of what comes next. Think about what that would have actually meant on the ground for an ordinary family living somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates in that generation. It was not an abstract theological problem. It was a monster the size of a tower walking toward your home, and no army, no wall, no ordinary weapon built by human hands could stop it. Enoch describes the cries of the oppressed reaching heaven, the earth itself groaning under the weight of what had been unleashed upon it. The text does not read like a moral fable. It reads like a record of terror, written by someone who understood exactly how close humanity came to being wiped out by something it never created and never asked for. Here is where the common story falls apart. If the flood was only a punishment for human sin, murder, violence, the ordinary corruption that Scripture elsewhere condemns, why would God need to destroy nearly all life on earth in a single catastrophic act? Human wickedness had existed since Cain killed Abel, and God did not flood the world then. Something changed between Genesis 4 and Genesis 6. Something new entered creation, something that was not simply sinful but was, in a very literal sense, not supposed to exist at all. Enoch's account suggests the flood was not primarily a response to bad behavior. It was a response to corruption at the level of creation itself. The Watchers had not just broken a moral law, they had broken the created order, mixing what heaven had never intended to mix, producing something that threatened to overwrite the human line entirely. Jude, writing centuries later in the New Testament, seems to confirm this was understood as a real and serious event, describing angels who kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, and are now reserved in chains under darkness until judgment. Peter's second letter says God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into gloomy dungeons to be held for judgment, in the very same breath that he mentions the flood and Noah. Two separate apostles connect the sin of these angels directly to the flood narrative, as if the two events could not be told apart. So when God tells Noah that he is grieved he made man and that he will destroy all flesh, the word flesh carries more weight than we usually give it. Every creature on earth had become corrupted, the text says. All flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth, not just humanity's moral choices. The flesh itself, the genetic physical line of what a human being was meant to be, had been altered by beings who were never supposed to touch it. Noah is described as perfect in his generations, a strange phrase if this is only about righteousness. Some ancient readers understood it to mean Noah's bloodline remained untouched, uncorrupted by what had spread across the rest of humanity. If that reading is even partly true, the flood was not an act of divine rage against sinners. It was closer to a surgical removal, a last attempt to preserve something that was being erased from the inside out before it disappeared completely. And this is only the beginning of what Enoch actually recorded. He did not simply describe the giants. He described what happened when the watchers realized judgment was coming, what they begged Enoch to do on their behalf, and the exact moment even the angels understood they had crossed a line that could never be undone. That part of the story is even harder to read than this one. If you want to walk through the entire account the way Enoch wrote it, image by image, with the fuller record of the watchers, the giants, and everything the church left out of Genesis, our companion guide lays it all out in full illustrated detail. It is linked in the pinned comment, and honestly, once you see the scenes laid out visually, Genesis 6 will never read the same way again. And if this kind of buried scripture speaks to something in you, subscribe now, because we are only getting started with what was hidden from the standard telling of this story. When the watchers finally understood what they had done, they did not go to God directly. They went to Enoch. Scripture calls him the man who walked with God, a phrase used for almost no one else in the entire Hebrew Bible, and it seems the watchers knew exactly what that closeness meant. They asked Enoch to carry a petition on their behalf, to write it down and present it before the throne, hoping that a human being who had God's ear might soften a judgment they already sensed was coming. Enoch agreed. He sat by the waters of Dan, south of Hermon, and read their words aloud until sleep came over him, and in that sleep, heaven opened. What Enoch saw was not a courtroom in any way we would picture one. He describes a house built of crystal, tongues of fire circling its walls, a throne surrounded by light too bright to look at directly, and a voice that came from beneath that throne rather than from the seat itself. This detail matters more than it first appears. In the ancient world, a throne with no visible occupant, yet a voice speaking from it, communicated something specific. This was not a being who needed to be seen to be believed. Enoch fell on his face, and the voice told him to rise and deliver the verdict himself, because the watchers had made their choice. And now Enoch would be the one to tell them there was no petition strong enough to undo it. The reason given is not simply that the watchers slept with human women. It goes deeper than that, and this is where Enoch's record adds something Genesis never explains at all. The watchers did not just cross a physical boundary. They handed humanity knowledge that was never meant to reach it, at least not in that form at that time. Azazel taught men how to forge swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, turning simple survival into organized violence. He showed women how to paint their eyes and adorn themselves with precious stones. And Enoch links this directly to the spread of fornication and corruption across the earth. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. Others among the 200 taught the signs of the sun and moon, the movements of the stars, cloud signs, the cutting of roots, astrology, and the knowledge of the clouds. None of this knowledge was evil by itself. Metalworking is not sin. Astronomy is not sin. But knowledge given before humanity was ready for it, stripped of any wisdom to carry its weight, became a weapon aimed at the very soul of the human race. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the entire flood narrative. The corruption that led to judgment was not only genetic, through the Nephilim, it was technological and spiritual. A flood of forbidden information poured into a species that had no framework to handle it responsibly. Men who once worked the ground with their hands now had blades forged for killing. Women who once needed no adornment beyond their own presence were taught vanity as a tool of manipulation. Enoch writes that the whole earth had been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel, and lays at his feet the responsibility for all the sin that followed. 4 archangels are named as witnesses to this collapse. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, described in Enoch as looking down from heaven and seeing the blood being shed on the earth, the cries of men reaching them from the ground itself. They brought the matter before God, and their words are recorded almost like a formal complaint, describing exactly what the watchers had unleashed, down to the detail that the giants had begun devouring each other in their hunger, mirroring the same appetite for destruction that had spread among the sons of men. It is a striking image, heaven itself, watching in something close to horror, waiting for permission to act. God's response was not a single act of destruction thrown down in anger. It was a sequence, deliberate and specific, assigned to each angel individually, almost like a surgeon planning separate incisions rather than one blunt strike. Raphael was sent to bind Azazel, to bury him in darkness in the desert, covering him with sharp stones until the day of judgment, when he would be cast into fire. Gabriel was sent to the sons of the Watchers, the giants themselves, to set them against one another so they would destroy each other by their own hands, a mercy of sorts, allowing the corruption to consume itself rather than be consumed by something else. Michael was sent to bind Semjaza and the others, who had joined themselves with the daughters of men, to hold them beneath the earth for 70 generations until the great judgment still to come. And only then, after the source of the corruption had been dealt with directly, does the flood itself enter the account, not as the first move, but as the final one. The cleansing that could only happen once the corrupting agents had already been contained. Read that order again, because it changes everything about how we usually picture Noah's story. The flood was not God's opening response to human sin. It was the last step in a much longer sequence, the final stage of a judgment that began with binding the source of the corruption before the earth itself could be purified of what that corruption had produced. Noah was not simply a righteous man saved from an angry God's momentary wrath. He was the surviving thread of something heaven had been working to protect since the moment the Watchers first descended on that mountain, generations before the rain ever started falling on the earth below. There is also something worth noticing in how carefully each punishment was matched to its crime. Azazel, who had given men weapons of iron and bronze, was buried beneath stone in darkness, the very material he had taught them to shape, now used to hold him down. The giants, who had grown by devouring the labor and lives of others, were turned against their own kind until they consumed themselves the same way they had consumed everything else. Nothing about this reads like random fury. It reads like a response built with precision, a wrong answered with an equal and opposite correction, generation after generation of consequence traced back to its exact origin point. Enoch is not describing a God who lashes out. He is describing a God who waits, watches, and then acts with a kind of restraint that somehow feels more unsettling than sudden anger ever could. This is what makes the flood, once it finally arrives in the narrative, so much heavier than the version most of us grew up hearing. By the time the waters came, judgment had already been passed on the beings responsible. The flood was never about punishing Noah's generation from a blank start. It was about finishing what had already begun far earlier, sealing shut a door that 4 archangels had watched being pried open, one watcher and one forbidden teaching at a time. Before any of this reaches the flood itself, there is a moment buried in the Genesis Apocryphon, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that almost never gets mentioned from a pulpit. It concerns the birth of Noah, and it reveals something startling. Lamech, Noah's own father, looked at his newborn son and was afraid. The child's skin was described as white as snow, red as a blooming rose, his eyes like the rays of the sun, and when he opened them, the whole room filled with light, as if the sun itself had risen inside the house. Lamech did not celebrate. He ran to his wife Bathanosh and accused her, asking whether the conception truly came from him, or whether it came from one of the Watchers, one of the sons of heaven, who had already proven capable of fathering children on the daughters of men. Think about what that fear reveals. By the time Noah was born, the crossing of that boundary between heaven and earth was no longer a rumor. It was common enough and terrifying enough that a father could look at his own extraordinary child and wonder if he was looking at another Nephilim, another product of the corruption that had already begun consuming the world around him. Bathanosh denied it and insisted the child was Lamech's own, but Lamech was not satisfied with her word alone. He went to his father Methuselah, and Methuselah went to Enoch himself at the very edges of the earth to ask whether this child was a sign, and if so, of what kind. Enoch's answer was that Noah was indeed a sign, but not of corruption. He was the sign of what would survive it, the line that had remained untouched, the seed that the flood was coming to preserve rather than destroy. This single family story reframes everything that follows. Noah was not chosen simply because he behaved well, while everyone around him behaved badly. Genesis calls him perfect in his generations, a phrase that, read against the background of what was happening across the earth at that time, suggests something closer to purity of lineage than moral perfection alone. Everyone else on earth had, in one way or another, been touched by what the Watchers unleashed. Whether through the spreading violence they taught, the corrupted bloodlines their offspring left behind, or simply the slow poison of a world reorganized around forbidden knowledge and forbidden unions. Noah's household stood apart, not because they were flawless people, but because they represented the last untouched thread of what humanity was originally meant to be. When God finally speaks to Noah directly, the instructions are staggeringly specific for what modern readers often imagine as a children's story. Build a vessel 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high, 3 decks, a single window, a door in the side. This is not the small round-hulled toy boat found in nursery decorations. Scholars who have worked through the dimensions describe something closer to the size of a modern ocean liner, built entirely from gopher wood, coated inside and out with pitch, an engineering project that would have taken Noah's family the better part of a century to complete, according to the chronology most conservative readings of Genesis produce. And Noah built it in full view of everyone. There is no indication in the text that this happened secretly. A structure of that size under construction for decades, in a world that Enoch describes as already filled with violence and corruption, would have drawn attention from every direction. Peter's second letter calls Noah a preacher of righteousness, implying he spoke to the people around him the entire time he was building, warning them and receiving nothing but mockery in return. Imagine spending 100 years constructing something the size of a small town's worth of timber, watched every single day by neighbors who thought you had lost your mind, while somewhere beneath the ground, the very beings responsible for the corruption around you were already bound in darkness, waiting for a judgment that had already been decided. Picture the ordinary rhythm of that century. Noah waking before sunrise to fell trees, his sons hauling timber, the pitch boiling somewhere nearby, the smell of it clinging to their clothes for years. Meanwhile, the towns around them carried on exactly as they always had. Marriages, harvests, disputes over land, children born into a world that had no idea a clock was already running out on it. Some ancient commentators imagined Noah's neighbors walking past the growing hull every day, laughing at the sheer size of it, asking what kind of flood could possibly justify a boat built nowhere near an ocean. Enoch's record makes clear that mockery was the least of what filled that world in those final generations. And still Noah kept building plank after plank, warning after warning that nobody outside his own household seemed willing to hear. Only 8 people entered that vessel in the end. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. 8, out of what must have been a considerable global population by that point in the biblical timeline. This detail alone should stop us. If the flood was simply about washing away ordinary human sin, the math does not make sense. Ordinary sin has existed in every generation since Eden, and God does not respond to every generation by drowning nearly all of it. But if the flood was about something closer to quarantine, about sealing off a corruption that had spread through bloodlines, knowledge systems, and the created order itself, then the survival of only one untouched family line becomes the entire point of the story, rather than an afterthought to it. The animals came in pairs, 7 of the clean, 2 of the unclean. A detail Enoch and later Jewish tradition connect to the future need for sacrifice once the earth had been cleansed. And then, in a single verse that carries more weight than almost anything else in Genesis, we are told that the Lord shut him in, not Noah closing his own door, God himself sealing it. After that verse, nothing outside the ark mattered anymore. What remained to be seen was only what the water would do to everything left behind. There is something almost unbearably quiet about that image. No trumpet, no final warning shouted across the land, just a door closing under a hand no one outside could see, while inside 8 people sat in the dark, listening to the sound of hooves and wing beats settling around them, waiting for whatever came next. Genesis describes what happened next in language that still carries force after thousands of years. The fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Water did not simply fall from the sky. It came up from beneath the earth at the same moment it came down from above, as if creation itself had been holding 2 separate doors shut, and both were released at once. 40 days and nights of rain followed, but the text is careful to note the water did not recede after 40 days. It continued rising for 150 days total before the earth began to dry, meaning the flood as an event, start to finish, spanned well over a year of Noah's life inside that vessel. Try to hold the scale of that in your mind for a moment. Every mountain covered, every city, every field, every forge where Azazel's weapons had once been hammered into shape, every place where the Nephilim had walked among terrified villages, gone beneath water 15 cubits deep above the highest peaks. Genesis states plainly that all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle, and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. The corruption that had spread from Mount Hermon outward across the entire ancient world was not merely defeated. It was erased down to the last physical trace, buried under water so complete that only the 8 souls sealed inside the ark, and whatever pairs of creatures traveled with them, remained to answer for what the earth would become next. But here is where Enoch's record adds something that Genesis simply does not have room to explain. Something that reshapes how we should think about spiritual evil for the rest of human history. The Nephilim themselves, those massive offspring of angel and human, died in the flood along with everyone else. Their bodies were destroyed the same as any other flesh, but Enoch insists their spirits did not go where human spirits go, because they were never fully human to begin with, born of 2 natures that were never meant to combine. Their spirits had nowhere to rest. They could not enter the realm of the dead the way ordinary souls did, and they could not return to heaven, since their origin already carried the guilt of heaven's own rebellion. Enoch describes them as becoming what he calls evil spirits on the earth, doomed to wander without bodies, without rest, and without home until the final judgment still to come. This single detail is the hinge on which an enormous amount of later scripture and tradition seems to turn. If the spirits of the Nephilim survived the flood as disembodied entities, roaming an earth that no longer had physical giants to contain them, then what the New Testament later calls demons, unclean spirits, evil spirits that possess and afflict, may trace their origin back to exactly this moment. Enoch is explicit that these spirits would afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, causing sickness and torment among human beings until the day appointed for their final punishment. This is not a stretch of interpretation invented by modern readers looking to connect old dots. It is stated directly in the text, and it explains something the New Testament otherwise leaves oddly unexplained. Consider how strange it actually is that Jesus spends so much of his ministry confronting entities that speak, that recognize him by name, that bargain and beg rather than simply being cast out in silence. The man among the tombs at Gerasa was possessed by a force that called itself Legion, that begged to be sent into a herd of pigs rather than into the abyss, showing an awareness of a coming judgment that ordinary human wrongdoing in Scripture never quite matches. Unclean spirits in the Gospels do not behave like abstract personifications of sickness. They behave like prisoners, already aware of their sentence, negotiating for time. Enoch's account gives that behavior a backstory that fits with an unsettling precision. Jesus and his disciples encountered unclean spirits constantly throughout the Gospels, entities that recognized Jesus immediately, that begged not to be sent into the abyss before their appointed time, that spoke with a fear and familiarity toward judgment that ordinary human sinners in Scripture simply do not display. Enoch's account gives that fear a backstory. These were not vague symbols of psychological illness. According to the tradition Enoch preserves, they were the surviving remnant of exactly the corruption the flood was sent to remove, and the flood, for all its power, could only destroy their bodies. It could not touch what they had become underneath. If this reading holds any weight, then the flood was never truly a complete ending. It was a containment measure with an unavoidable gap in it, a judgment that erased the physical threat while leaving behind a spiritual one that Scripture continued wrestling with for the rest of its pages. That gap may be exactly why deliverance from unclean spirits becomes such a repeated, central feature of Christ's ministry centuries later. Not as an unrelated miracle category, but as the final stage of a cleanup that began with Noah's flood and was never going to be finished by water alone. There is also a sobering symmetry worth noticing here. The watchers who fathered the Nephilim were bound beneath the earth to await judgment. Their offspring's spirits, once their bodies were destroyed, were left to roam above it, neither bound nor free, waiting for the same day their fathers were waiting for beneath the mountains. Heaven and earth had been divided by their crime in the beginning, and after the flood, that same division ran straight through the aftermath. Fathers imprisoned below, their children scattered above. Both halves of the same broken boundary, held apart from full judgment until Enoch says the appointed time finally comes. It also means the flood should never really be read as the climax of this story. It reads more like the middle of it. The water solved the physical emergency, the immediate threat of a corrupted bloodline overwhelming what remained of ordinary humanity. But it left an open wound running through the spiritual world that Scripture spends the rest of its pages trying to address. One exorcism, one confrontation, one binding at a time, all the way through to the final chapters of Revelation, where judgment against these same fallen powers is finally promised to be complete. Here is the part of the story that should stop every casual reading of Genesis in its tracks. If the flood erased the Nephilim completely, wiping out every trace of that corrupted bloodline along with everything else that breathed, why does Scripture keep mentioning giants for centuries afterward? Genesis 6:4 itself contains the phrase almost no one stops to examine closely. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. Not before the flood only, after it. The very verse that introduces the Nephilim in the first place quietly admits they did not disappear when the waters receded. Something allowed that bloodline, or something enough like it, to return. Numbers chapter 13 confirms it directly generations later, when Moses sends spies into Canaan. They come back terrified, describing a land that devours its inhabitants, and among the people they saw were the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, so enormous that the spies said, "We were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." This was not folklore passed down second-hand. This was a first-hand military report from trained men sent specifically to assess the land, and their conclusion was that an entire nation of giants stood between Israel and the promise God had made them. Deuteronomy adds a detail so specific it reads almost like an artifact description rather than a story. King Og of Bashan, one of the last of the remnant of giants, had a bed made of iron, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, roughly 13 feet by 6 feet, by the more conservative cubit measurements scholars use. That is not a poetic exaggeration meant to frighten children. That is a preserved physical measurement, recorded with enough precision that later readers could go verify it, sitting in Rabbah of the children of Ammon, according to the text. And centuries after that, when David faced Goliath of Gath, the Philistine champion is described in a lineage explicitly connected to the same giant clans, standing somewhere between 9 and 11 feet tall, depending on which ancient manuscript tradition is followed, armed with a spear whose iron head alone weighed 600 shekels. It is worth remembering just how young David was when he walked out to face that lineage alone, a shepherd boy with a sling, standing in front of an army too afraid to move. Every soldier in Saul's ranks had grown up hearing the same stories Israel had carried since the days of the spies, stories of a bloodline too large and too old to be beaten by ordinary weapons. Goliath was not simply a large man from an intimidating family. To Israelite ears, he was the last visible reminder that the corruption Enoch described had never been fully closed off, that something from before the flood was still walking the earth, wearing bronze armor and mocking the armies of the living God. So the honest question becomes unavoidable. If the flood was sent specifically to remove this corruption from the earth, And it worked. How did the same corruption reappear on the other side of it? Enoch himself never gives a full explanation, and this is significant. He is willing to describe the Watchers' original descent on Mount Hermon in exhaustive, almost forensic detail, naming 20 of their leaders individually, listing what each one taught humanity. But when it comes to what happened after the flood, to how the bloodline returned, his record grows noticeably quieter. Some later Jewish tradition suggests the wives of Ham, Noah's own son, carried tainted blood onto the ark itself, smuggled through the one door of the vessel that God did not personally inspect. Other traditions suggest a second, smaller incursion of angelic beings took place generations after the flood, echoing the first, though on a scale small enough that it did not require another global judgment to correct. This is very likely the horror Enoch chose not to spell out in full. A man who could describe crystal thrones, bound angels, and giants devouring one another without flinching suddenly grows careful, almost guarded, the moment the subject turns to what survived his own generation's judgment. It is one thing to record a catastrophe safely sealed in the past. It is another thing entirely to record that the same catastrophe found a way through, and that the people reading his words centuries later would still be living somewhere inside its unfinished aftermath. Whatever the mechanism, the pattern itself is what should unsettle us most. Judgment removed the corruption once completely, and it still found a way back into the human story within a matter of generations. This is not the tone of a threat that gets solved and closed. It is the tone of a wound that keeps reopening, treated again and again across the biblical timeline, through the conquest of Canaan, through David and Goliath, through the ongoing spiritual warfare language that runs underneath so much of the Old Testament's military history, warfare that always seems to carry a weight beyond ordinary human conflict between nations. And this may be exactly why Jesus, standing centuries later on the Mount of Olives, chose the specific comparison he did when his disciples asked him about the end of the age. He did not point them toward the plagues of Egypt, or the fall of Jericho, or any of the other dramatic judgments scattered through Israel's history. He pointed them toward Noah. As the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. He described people eating, drinking, marrying, going about ordinary life completely unaware of what was building around them, until the flood came and took them all away. If Enoch's account of what actually happened before that flood is even partially accurate, then Jesus was not making a simple comparison about people being distracted by daily life. He was drawing a direct line between two moments in history where the created order itself had become compromised, where boundaries between heaven and earth had been crossed in ways ordinary human eyes could not fully perceive until it was already too late to prepare. That comparison alone should be enough to make anyone pause. Whatever Enoch witnessed, whatever he refused to spell out completely in his own record, whatever mechanism allowed the corruption to survive one global judgment and resurface generations later, the same voice that spoke through Genesis and through Enoch's visions, is the voice that later told his own followers to watch for a repeat of exactly this pattern. Not the flood itself returning, but the conditions that made the flood necessary in the first place, quietly rebuilding themselves again, the way they apparently always have. Enoch saw what the flood was truly answering, and even he chose his words with care. That kind of restraint tells you everything about how seriously this story deserves to be taken. If you want the fuller picture, the Watchers, the giants, and everything Genesis leaves out, laid out visually, in a way that makes this history impossible to unsee, our illustrated guide is waiting in the pinned comment below. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through. If it moved something in you, subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments what parts surprised you most. There is more buried scripture waiting on this channel, and the next video is already on your screen.